Hi, everybody, and welcome again, or welcome back to those who joined us in May for Jacinta's webinar on Mastery in Explicit Teaching Practices. My name is Kate McGough, and I'm the Head of Primary Portfolios here at Nelson. You today are attending the Unravelling Text Structure, a research-based approach presented by Jacinta Conway. I'll just give it a moment as people join us. So before we get started and before we jump in, I'll just take you through some housekeeping. You will notice that your camera and your microphone are both off. This is to minimize background noise, as there are a few of you on the webinar today. If you do have any questions that come up during the webinar, please pop these into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And we will have some time for Jacinta to respond to the questions at the end of the session. And for questions that we don't get to, we will follow up with you after the session. Any technical issues, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, which my colleague Jasmine will be monitoring throughout the session. And finally, this webinar is being recorded today, and you will receive a recording in about a week's time. So I'm very excited to introduce you to Jacinta Conway. Jacinta is an education consultant and literacy intervention specialist based in Melbourne. Jacinta has taught in schools for more than 20 years and is now the Director of Impact Tuition, where she tutors students and coaches teachers to implement evidence-based learning strategies. And she currently works in an independent school in Melbourne. I'll now pass over to Jacinta. Thanks, Jacinta.
Thanks, Kate. I will get straight into this presentation because I'm trying to fit a lot in. We will start with an acknowledgement of country. We respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of this country where we are meeting today. Our conference is being held on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, part of the Kulin Nation, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. I also extend this respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in attendance today. So last one we did was explicit instruction within a structured literacy block. Now we're going to be looking at unravelling text structure. Today we will be looking at examining how text structure can be considered in an Australian context with the Australian curriculum and looking at practical examples from early to upper primary. Okay, so in our last presentation, we reviewed the 5 components of language, which were phonology, morphology, which was the meaningful parts of words. Phonology is the sound-based system. Syntax is looking at the word order of our language. Semantics is the multiple meanings, and pragmatics is language in a social context. And we also looked at the big 5 of reading, which has been the big 5 that has had the focus over the last 20 or 30 years, and really looking at science of reading here with the phonemic awareness, systematic phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. And we know that they all interrelate and interconnect when we're teaching literacy. We also looked at models of reading, looking over here, we've got the simple view of reading, looking at decoding with language comprehension gives us our reading comprehension. We looked at Scarborough's reading rope, the active view of reading, and also the cognitive foundations model, which is what I'm going to look at more closely now. Okay, so with that in mind, let's have a look at this model. This framework can guide assessment and interventions, and it's divided up into the reading comprehension under the 2 frameworks of language comprehension and word recognition. I really like the way this is built up so that you can see the big picture, and you can also see all the components that need to work together to give you your reading comprehension. The language comprehension includes a linguistic knowledge, background knowledge, and inferencing. Word recognition involves the phonemic awareness, letter knowledge, understanding of the alphabetic principle, and the print concepts. And these elements combine for instant word recognition. in order to enable effective reading comprehension. Our focus today on text structure falls under the language comprehension, but does also span across the curriculum. So we'll review how structured literacy incorporates text structure within comprehension activities and some fluency practice. I'd also just like to acknowledge that I'll be using some graphic organisers from the book called The Writing Rope to counteract the components of writing that link with the reading components of text structure. So I'm going to be using the not the Victorian curriculum, the Australian curriculum version 9, and looking at where text structure fits here. So we've got the 3 strands of English, language, literacy, and literature. And then from there, we have our sub-strands, and text structure and organisation actually fits into the language component. So even though we're reading the texts in the literacy and literature, it makes a lot more sense to actually have text structure in and organisation in language. One of the ways I like to think about this is if you're ever trying to listen to a child give you a narrative or a recount, for example, you might be on duty in the prep playground and you're trying to ascertain what actually happened. When children are really young, they find it really difficult to tell you sequence of events in sequence, and it's something that we get better at over time. So you can see that idea of understanding what happened and the sequence of events really comes into that structural organisation and how you communicate yourselves in language. Okay, what I've done here is I've taken the curriculum, and instead of having all of a year group on a page, I've taken the text structure strand and placed it all the way from foundation through to year 10 so that we can see the development of this strand. One of the things I think is key to note here are the verbs. So you can see the types of verbs that are used early on in foundation to year 2. We've got a lot of understand, explore and identify. Moving into the middle years and upper primary, we've still got understand, identify, but you can see towards year 6, we're starting to now ask students to be able to explain how texts work across the curriculum. Knowing where we're moving forward on from that, when you get into the secondary years, towards the end, you've got examine, analyze and investigate. Okay. From here, the next thing I want to look at is not the verbs, it's more the content knowledge. So we're now going to be looking at the subject nouns, and you can see where the words texts is acknowledged throughout the curriculum here. And then from here, the key word is actually how texts are organised. So in all of primary, the term text structure as a term doesn't actually come up as much as what it does as far as the organisation of text. We can then see that there are terms as far as how we use cohesion and the connectives and where they come up in the curriculum here. And then we have the conventions and the features of language. So they're a little bit more, you can see them here very much so in the early years. And then if we move into the upper years of primary, we have some of those features. It's in the secondary area that you actually see the terms text structure come up. Even though I think that as primary teachers, we just think that we're doing it, it's interesting to know that where that language actually comes into the curriculum. It's not until you really, I think, delve into the curriculum and give yourself time to really process the depth of the curriculum that you take these things away. And for me, if this was one thing that I took away from this presentation, it's how much time it takes to get to know our curriculum, and then the cumulative nature of each substrand. So that's the curriculum. The other part of the curriculum that I think is really important to know and understand is what sort of terms we use when we're talking about text structure and writing texts. If you go through the progressions and look at what we actually use as terms here, We might think it's just narrative, formative, informative, but what we've actually got here are the terms informative, persuasive, and imaginative. We do get a lot of our resources from beyond Australian. We're becoming a much more global society. So with that in mind, some of the resources that I've come across, I will be hearing terms like informational, which is very much an American term, as well as opinion argument and narrative. I suppose if you look at the term informative compared to informational, they look like they're almost the same, but there is a slight difference between the two. One could be almost an action of something that you're doing, and one could almost be a bit more of a descriptive. Once you've got our 3 text types here for writing, I think it's really nice to see them as umbrella terms and see the forms that can complete underneath. I know when I first started teaching, we would have about 8 to 10 different text structure posters up on the wall, and we would think that we needed to get our way through all those 8 to 10. I find it much easier to think of things in threes or 5s, because you can do them on one hand, and it's much easier to remember with our working memories. So with that in mind, I've color-coded the informative, persuasive, and imaginative so that you can see how we can have these umbrella terms and the types of forms of writing or reading that you could have within that. Okay, before I go on to text structure, I just wanted to make one point here about teaching text structure and ensuring that students really understand text structure is a really important skill to have. But before we do any of this sort of teaching, it's really more important to be teaching literature so that they're getting as much exposure to literature as they can. It doesn't have to be narratives that we're talking about here. It just needs to be as much exposure to good, high quality texts, because that's where you're going to get your language and your higher language and vocabulary from. Teaching text structure, when I'm really teaching it, I may not be using really complex literature to begin with, because I want to keep everything as simple as possible so that the concept is understood as easily as it possibly can, as some students find text structure much harder to understand than others. One moment. So why do we teach text structure? Knowing the text structure helps us to improve comprehension. It enhances our writing skills because it teaches us what sort of elements to be using when we're writing. It supports critical thinking and it facilitates different types of reading, and also aids in identifying the key points or key information when we're reading. It also supports content learning. I'm going to start with narrative today for the 3 text structures that we're going to be looking at. Narrative writing tells a story about an experience, event, or sequence of events and is organized around these events. So it includes elements like setting, characters, and a problem and a solution. This graphic organizer comes from the writing rope, and I'm going to be using these 3 graphic organizers as we go through so that you can see when you keep them simple, like this graphic organizer is, it makes it quite easy to compare as we move through the text types. So you can see here we've got our beginning, middle, and end. Here we can see that we know narratives are stories that are written to entertain us, and they help us to develop an understanding. Narratives can be short stories that have a beginning, middle, and end. The people in the narratives are called characters. Where the story takes place is called the setting. And this also includes the time, which could be the time of the day, week, month, or even a special time of the year. At the moment, I'm teaching Year 7, and I've noticed that with Year 7 students, they know automatically that the setting is place. They do not know that it is time. And the more complex the texts get as we move through, time sequences can go backwards and forwards, which can make the texts much harder to comprehend. So knowing that it's setting this time and place and being able to do that automatically enhances comprehension. The plot is the events that take place in the story. And from here, narratives can also have the point of view of the first or the third person. And I will just use the common language of these are the elements of a narrative so that I can read a text and demonstrate how I can actually model and teach a narrative. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a few sentences of a text, and then I'm going to stop. I'm going to make an initial prediction to say what I think the text type is. Quite often when we think of prediction, we're thinking we're going to predict what's going to happen in a text. I'm going to use the skill of prediction to predict the text type. So when I do that, I will say, I think it is. And then what I will do is I will read on. And when I read on from the text that I'm going to read, I will then stop and support my prediction. And I'll either say, I still think, or I now think. I'm going to keep it simple today. I'm not going to change my prediction when I model this. And then when I finish the passage that I'm reading, I will confirm my prediction. And I will do that by saying, I know. And then I'll say, I know that this is a narrative because. So because I'm doing three things here, which is my metacognitive thinking strategies, these metacognitive strategies I'm doing are predicting, supporting, and confirming. And while I'm doing that on one hand, on the other hand, I'm going to use the elements of this narrative to work that out. So I'm doing quite a lot in my head. So that's why I keep my text nice and simple. And I plan my initial model as simply as I possibly can. For the purpose of the first narrative, I'm going to use a decodable. The reason I'm using a decodable is to keep it simple. So this is Sam in the cab, and this comes from your set 2, from your new decodable series. And I'm going to start reading this. And I might say to the students, we know narratives are made up of stories that are written to entertain us and to help us develop an understanding of the world. Narratives can be short stories that have a beginning, middle, and end. The people are called characters, and where the story takes place is called a setting. This includes the time, which could be the time of the day, week, month, or even the special time of the year. And we know that the events in the story are called the plot. Listen as I read this story. Beck can see Sam. Sam is in the cab. Sam sits in the cab. So I'm going to stop there and say, I think this is a narrative. The characters are Beck and Sam. And the setting looks like it's one day at a work site. I will read on to support my prediction. Bam! Sam rams a tap. The cab has hit the tap. And looks like Beck is saying, Sam, the tap. So now I will say, I still think this is a narrative, and it looks like we've got more of a plot developing. It's a simple plot, but I can see that we've started with a very clear beginning that Sam and Beck were at the work site, and now something has happened. Beck has a hat. It fits the tap. Sam can see the hat. Okay, it looks like Sam has come up with a solution to the problem, which means I still believe this is a narrative and the plot is developing with a problem and a solution. Okay, so now that I've finished reading this, I'm going to take this narrative and I'm going to put it onto a text structure organizer. When I model my text structure organizer, I'm going to write down all the components that are in the narrative, and then I might store it as an anchor chart or as a poster or a PowerPoint, and then when it's time to start writing, I might pull this out and do a writing task where I'll say, let's write some sentences about Sam and Beck, and it will be integrated and linked into the work that the students will be doing as far as their scope and sequence with beginning sounds, so that there's nothing here that would be too complex for them to take away and write about. Oops-a-daisy. Okay, so from here, I've now done my text structure and I've modeled my text structure. And then from there, I'm now going to move into the next text type. To summarize what I've done here, I predicted the text type. I knew that the text was a narrative. I used elements from this poster on the narrative to guide my thinking and comprehension as I read. When modeling the text structure, I used explicit instruction, and I carefully modeled, or I planned my model before I taught it. So I've got the script ready to go, and I rehearse it a few times before I deliver it so that it becomes a natural language to use. No doubt that working with little people, things come up. So having a script ready to go with exactly what I'm going to model supports the next stage of the explicit teaching, which would be the check for understanding questions. And my questions might be, tell me who the characters were. What do you think I was doing when I said, I think this is a narrative? And they might answer with, oh, you predicted the text type. Okay, teaching text structure. So those processes that I'm going through there are monitoring and controlling my thought processes, and the metacognitive strategy instruction is teaching learners to think about their thinking and the meta thinking that they're doing to provide them with strategies to monitor their own thinking as they read. Next, we will look at informative texts, and I will model and coach an informative text. Okay, informative texts provide or examine information, organised into sections and subsections with main ideas. We're going to look at the gradual release model here for looking at informative texts. Okay, the informative texts examine previously learned information or provide you with new information. They're organised into sections and subsections, which include paragraphs and main ideas, and tends to be organised hierarchically. So here we have another graphic organiser where we can see that we've got, instead of beginning, middle, end, we've got an introduction, the body part of the informative, and then a conclusion. And each one of those subsections has their own structural components that we need to adhere to when we're and be able to know and identify when we're reading. And also, once we've read enough of these, it will support us to be able to know and identify how we can write. Of interest, it is easier for young children to write an informative text than it is for them to write a narrative. Usually you get a topic of interest for them where they can collect as much information as possible, and it doesn't have to have the same level of sequence, and it does not have as much complex punctuation that's required for a narrative. Let's have a look at this informative graphic organizer here. I will use the elements of this poster to predict the text type. Authors write informative texts to inform and explain. I will consider the author's purpose as I read on, and I will predict the topic and the main idea as I read. I will use the information to support and revise my predictions of the text. Okay. Informatives are usually written in the third person. They can't really be written in the first person. If they're written in the first person, you've got an opinion. So it's nice to be able to know which terminology, when it comes to nouns and pronoun agreements, that you would be using when you're reading and writing an informative text. Just as before, I will read a few sentences. I will make a prediction, say I think. I will read a few more to support. And then at the end, I will confirm my understanding of an informative. Okay. This text is called, it's not a story, this text is called Looking at Fish. Okay. I'm going to read this. I can already predict that this looks to me like it would be an informative text. This is another one of the decodables. It's a much higher set because it's got graphemes in it of, I think it's got the SH, and it's also got the ING in this one as well, and the double O. I'm going to read and I'll make a prediction. Fish can be little or big, but they all have gills and fins. Fish can be quick as they swim and swish. Okay, I think this is an informative text. There are already many facts about fish. There are no characters. The fish are not characters because they are not saying anything and acting like humans do. I think the topic is all about fish. The main idea might be that all fish have some things that are the same, but they can also have special features. So what have I just done there? I have predicted the topic and the main idea, and I've used facts to support this. I'll now read on to support my prediction. Okay. The fish is a red rock cod. This fish is a red rock cod. It can look like rocks. It can dash up to get little fish. Some fish do not look much like fish. This fish is very long. See it swish. Some fish have fangs. They can nip little fish. They do not nip kids. This fish is very big. It has lots of dots on its back. This big fish can swish its fins, but it is not in a rush. So this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I still think this is an informative and there are a lot of facts about fish. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to underline all the facts about fish that I can see here. I've got red rock, looks like a rock. They can dash and they can get little fish. I've got, they do not look, some fish don't look like other fish. Some are very long, some swish. And I keep going and I would be modeling, underlining all my facts. And then I'm going to number them off to say these are, looks like I've got 11 facts here that I've got about fish. So what I'm going to now do while I'm supporting my belief that this is an informative text is I'm going to organize these facts into sub areas, and they will be the facts. Some of these facts are either about the appearance or about the movement of fish. So I've now organized them into sections. So this, by organizing it to this degree, I can now determine the main idea and if it's more about appearance or if it's more about movement or if it's equally balanced here. I'll finish reading to confirm my thinking. This fish has lots of long fins. The fins on its back can sting. Pets can get fish, kids can get fish as pets. It is fun looking at a fish as it swims and swishes its fins. So I've got more facts here and I'm going to add these facts to my folders on appearance and movement. So I've added in the lots of long fins and I've also added in down here that they can sting. So to complete now, I will say I know this is an informative text. There were definitely no characters and I got lots of information about fish and how they have some of them have similarities, but they've also got things that are unique about them. So they are not all the same. I can put this information onto another graphic organizer and I can store this information so that at another point in time, we can use this for writing. So that was the model for informative. So you can start to see that there's a common language that I'm using with the I think, I still think, I now know, whether it's an informative or whether it's a narrative. Finally, I'm going to write and demonstrate my understanding for a persuasive text. So persuasive texts aim to convince the reader of a particular viewpoint using claims, reasons, and evidence. Children naturally use persuasive language, making this a relatable and engaging text type to teach. What does a persuasive do? It gives an opinion, which I've just mentioned, and the text structure is organized around specific text components, claims, reasons, evidence, counterclaims, and even rebuttals as we go into more complex middle to upper primary. Again, you can see the graphic organizer. We've got our introduction, body, and conclusion. And instead of facts this time, we've got reasons as our main components to support the structure of this text type. Okay, this text is called Which Pet is Best? And it's from the new Nova Star series. I've been playing around with this text with some students, and we used this the other day, and the first thing we did was we graphed our preferences for for the pets. And I used an app for this called Braining Camp, where you can do different maths apps. So I thought it would be a nice little link for this task. Once kids love pets and they love talking about pets. I can't believe how many kids knew what this little one was. I didn't actually know what an oxalotl was until I read this. Okay. So here we have the text, and I've already modeled. So this time I'm not going to model the same approach again. Rather, what I will say to you is I'll give you 30 seconds just to have a quick look at the text on the screen. And then I will pretend to ask you a question. So what I would do here is if the students were reading these texts, instead of me saying, I think, I would just flip it and now say, now you tell me what you're thinking. And you would be saying, I think this is a persuasive text. And then my feedback would be, great, you've just made a prediction that the text type is persuasive. Now use elements of the persuasive poster to tell me why you think that. So therefore, it's no longer becoming the teacher teaching explicitly and modelling and asking check for understanding questions. We're moving away from that, and we're moving into a dialogic approach where I would be just asking what you're thinking, and then my feedback to what you're thinking would be based on what you state. Sometimes texts will give you a mixture of text types where you can really sort of get into more broad discussions about why you want to position yourself as to what the text type is. So this is the text. This is the text rewritten here from here. And you can see now it's starting to look more like the formal persuasive text type that we might use when we write in early primary, or probably around year 2. So you can see here we've got a clear statement of claim and a clear conclusion. And then the next part here, we have our 3 reasons. And our 3 reasons happen to be the topic sentences of these paragraphs. Once I've got these 3 reasons here, I can put this information onto a graphic organizer. So this is the opinion writing template that you can see here. And I've just rewritten this information here onto dogs are the best pets. Here are the 3 reasons. And here is some additional information that I read that demonstrate or support each main idea. I'm then asked to provide a conclusion that restates it, which I went with dogs are the best, or this text says honey is the best. And then I had to summarize my reasons. So I re-summarized that they're loyal, fun, clever, and affectionate, and then need to provide some closure. I have to decide which transition words I'm using. So here the transition words are quite simple. We've got also another because, for example, that you can see here. Okay. Moving more towards upper primary now. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Behind the News. Either you teach using Behind the News, or you might even remember watching it when you were younger in school. This one here, which says age verification trial, this is from last week. So it's still accessible, and it's about the age limit for students to access social media. It's really interesting, excuse me. Sorry about that. It's really interesting about the content that takes place in this nearly 4-minute online text. And you can see here there are some really good questions that you get provided with when you go to the teacher tools. There are not many questions here on text type, but if you are already teaching text type, and you'll notice that when I was modeling earlier, the amount of time that I'm actually spending on teaching text type and modeling it, you can really break it down to about 3 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes. So it doesn't need to take up a massive proportion of your lesson. And if you're just doing your simple couple of minutes model over time, that time will build up to the point where it becomes quite intrinsic to be having those very quick conversations and interactions about text structure. You really don't want to spend too much time on text structure, but you need to acknowledge it so that then you can get into the actual comprehension of the content that you're reading. So what else is really good about this text here is that when you go to the online website, they now give you the transcript of everything that was stated. So you can put that transcript to then, you know, if I wanted to prepare a lesson, I can take that transcript and actually use it to plan my own opinion piece based on this piece on age verification. So this one here is called the summary template. And what I did here is I summarized the BTN segment with the 6 dot points here. I then wrote what I thought was a good introductory sentence, which states the topic. And then I turned those main ideas into my own words. So here I've had to list the ideas in phrase form. So you can see here that these are my summary statements on age verification trial. And then they're not all complete sentences. They might be phrases or shorter amounts. And then I take that information to write myself a more detailed introductory sentence that discusses what age verification trial goes into. When you watch BTN, they tend to animate things and add characters in. So it makes it harder for students to be able to as clearly see what the text type is or what the text structure and the purpose of that text is, because it is entertaining. They add entertaining components in. So it's without knowing text structure and having that quite firm and established before you get to reading and analysing different types of text like this, it can be much harder to actually identify the text structure. From here, we then, once we've got our main ideas and our introductory sentence, we can then turn these into our own sentences. And so now I've put that into a paragraph. The internet offers numerous opportunities for learning and entertainment, but also poses risks by exposing children to harmful content. To address this, the Australian government proposes using age verification technology. This technology aims to protect children from inappropriate material, as current age restrictions are often bypassed. Age verification would enhance online security by ensuring only age-appropriate content is accessible. Additionally, educating children about online safety is crucial to help them navigate the digital world responsibly. So from there, the next point, once you've made up your ideas and you put them into sentences, is to then add transition words in. And we add these transition words in to make our text more cohesive. And so you can see here that I have added in but also, to address this, in addition, as, and finally. I didn't really need to proofread it and edit it because I got it right the first time. But if I was modeling this, I would actually probably make some errors here so that I could then have a rewritten piece. Once I've got all of this information, what I can do with this now is I can say I've actually got enough information here to then turn this into my own opinion piece. So you can see here I've actually got the introduction. I've created 3 reasons that I gathered from this BTN piece, and then I can now put it into my own longer writing task or essay, depending on the terminology you use in your schools. We've got the reasons. I've just color-coded where I would place my reasons, and then where I would restate my claim, summarizing my reasons, and providing some closure. So having these graphic organizers to match our texts, there's two ways we can do it. We can start with the text and we can backwards map onto a graphic organizer, and by doing that process, we're actually establishing, by backwards planning, the process that writers go through to actually plan their writing. So children become much more familiar with the process of planning by using graphic organizers to backwards plan. And here it is now as a essay. So you can see that I've annotated it for topic sentences. I've got my three reasons put in. I've underlined all my connectives that I've used, and I've got my more formal piece of persuasive. So we've got opinion and persuasive, and we can sort of move that into argumentative. So you can see here with this graphic organizer, compared to the opinion, is that we start to get more complex with some of the information that we can put on our graphic organizer. So in conclusion, I'm doing quite well for time, I think. I've got quicker than I thought I was going to be. We have now examined text structure and how it can be considered in an Australian context. We can see, even from the beginning, when we looked at those three types, that other countries use different terminology. So when we're gathering resources from other countries, we've got to be aware of what we have in our curriculum. And I've given you some examples of how you can teach text structure from the early primary right through to upper primary, looking at narrative, informative, and persuasive. That's it. I was wondering if anyone has any questions from here that they would like to ask. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Jacinta. Just while I give people some time to sort of think about any questions that they may have, I was thinking of one actually while I was listening, and how can teachers effectively differentiate instruction when teaching text structure? Because we know that there's a range of abilities within a classroom, and you know, just looking at one graphic organizer, I was thinking about differentiation. So I just wonder if you could talk to that.
Yeah. So with those graphic organizers that I had up earlier, I might see if I can. I can see. I'm not sharing, am I? I was wondering why I could see myself.
No, you're not sharing at the moment.
I'll go back and I'll share, and I'll just show you how I would answer that. For starters, when I put up these graphic organizers here, these show you the structure really simply, beginning, middle, and end. And I feel like sometimes when we do a narrative text, for example, we can get very complex very quickly. But I think it's really important to start simple, and even having the simple decodables, how you've got very simple beginning, middle, and ends. That's a really nice way to start when you're teaching a narrative. When I had the narrative here, if I was going, that's a very simple poster. There's not a lot on this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces of information. If I was going to differentiate as I move up through the years, I would add more things to the poster. For example, for characters, I might add in terms like protagonist or antagonist, so they can see what types of characters that I would be asking the students to look for. So if there was a language difficulty, because this comes under the strand of language rather than literacy, we know that it's a language, it's something that we can acquire. So if there's a language difficulty with this, the differentiation would be, I would keep things simple with my graphic organizer here, and then I would just add complexity as I go up through the school, which means that you could develop banks of graphic organizers that support your needs of what you're actually teaching. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. That does. Thank you. We haven't got any questions coming through, but I was thinking about everything. So I'm going to ask one more actually, just to give people some time. But really, just all in your experience, Jacinta, what are some common challenges that teachers face when teaching text structure? So, and addressing those. I mean, I think your webinar has done that, but
I think what I've found is that when students have to write, the one thing they find really hard to do is structure it. And when you, even if you're analysing your NAPLA, quite often it's the paragraphing that they're not getting quite right. And so, or they might start, so they might write a narrative, they might have a good clear start, but all of a sudden it doesn't really have a clear ending. It's almost, and sometimes it can even start, for example, in the first person or third person. They can start writing in the third person, all of a sudden they put themselves into the story. So that's a knowledge of text structure and being able to keep things tight and know what you're going to write about. So I think there's some of the challenges that you'll have when you move towards upper primary. It's organizing your ideas and keeping the ideas within your paragraph to the one idea that you've decided that you're going to write about. And thirdly, looking at whatever it was that you were going to write about and sticking to your plan, because it's I think that can be quite hard to do. With some of the older students that I work with, when they have to write an essay, they find it really hard to plan because they haven't had enough experience planning and they just want to go straight in. So with that component of difficulty, I recommend that they plan one idea, get started with the writing, and then go back and plan their second idea, which may come as they've actually started writing.
And that makes me sort of think that graphic organisers are probably a really great way or a tool to help students actually do their planning.
Yeah, they're critical. They're critical because it gives a common language and it makes it gives students, it lets them know exactly what they're meant to be doing. So backwards modelling, so having the graphic organiser and backwards planning first before you get them to then write, and even pulling them all out when you build up your own bank. So if you keep using the same ones every time you read something, unpacking it quickly onto a graphic organiser means that you're building up your bank of writing tasks that you can pull out later to use to maybe even now rewrite this story, or maybe your writing tasks will be based on the graphic organisers that you built up.
It's a great idea, Jacinta. Well, I think that might be, I'm just going to jump into the Q&A. Excuse me.
I can see one question there, I think.
Yeah, there is. That the structure for the narrative you shared is very simple. Don't you think we need to introduce orientation, problem, series, events, resolution from the start, as having beginning, middle, and end can be confused with a recount?
Yeah, good question. I would say a recount has all those narrative elements in it. And I purposely didn't use the term recount today, because when we write a recount, it's usually in the first person, but we do use narrative elements. And a narrative element of a recount could be a little bit like what you would end up writing as an anecdote. So I agree with what you're saying there to a degree. But I also think that when you start writing a narrative, you want to keep it more, I would say keep it more simple, because they're very hard to write. Then as you move into the middle and upper primary, that's when you might start, I've just lost the Q&A, about the orientation, the problem, the series of events. So even in that small text that we read earlier, the Sam and the cab, there was a problem. It just wasn't as complex a problem. And what I find what students tend to do is they overcomplicate their problems when they're writing a narrative. They also overcomplicate the number of characters they've got. So giving them really tight structure to begin with, and then bringing in those orientation series of events and resolutions, I would be doing that later rather than earlier. I think in the early primary, a simple narrative is enough to be able to write.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Jacinta, and thank you to everyone who's attended the webinar today. We hope you found it useful. Just a reminder that if you haven't registered already for the final webinar in this series, it's leveraging formative assessments, and that's on the 20th of June, and you can find that on our website. So thank you for joining us today, and have a lovely evening, everybody.